I'm going to cover now a little bit on animating your objects in Amorphium Pro in regards to moving, rotating, and scaling your objects, and kind of how animation works in general within Amorphium. So first thing you'll notice, I have a little square box object in my scene. Now, to create a animation, you need to start out by making keyframes. Now, keyframes are points in time where the computer records where that object has changed in time, and then it interpolates between keyframes to move or rotate or do whatever to the object to get it to that position. So right now you'll see in the project window these little green squares, and they're green right now because that's saying that that is where my time playback head is currently positioned. If I move this away, you can see they're red. Well, these are keyframes, and it always starts out with a default keyframe at 0, which is recorded where your object's position and shape and everything has been recorded. So now to create a new keyframe, I just need to move my timeline to where I want that new keyframe to be. So I'm going to move to the 3-second mark, and as soon as I go to do something to this object, like say I go to move the object, it's going to ask me to create a keyframe because there is no keyframe at that point. And now I'm trying to do something to that object. It's saying, oh, well, you need to add a keyframe because you're going to be changing where that object's located at a different point in time. So I'm going to go ahead and say add keyframe. So now you can see my mesh cube here has a keyframe at frame 3 at that location. Now, because the keyframe is exactly the same as where it was, that you won't see anything change. But now if I make sure that I am on that keyframe at that particular point, and then if I move my object, now I'm saying, okay, I want my object to be there at frame 3, at the 3-second frame. So now if I move my slider, you can see it, the computer is interpolating where it is moving that object to that position. Now if I come halfway in between and then want to move it again, and I add my keyframe, and I move it in a different position, now it's going to make a nice little arc there. Now all of the keyframes for motion are smoothed. Morphium doesn't have a way to change between linear and like a smooth curve of your keyframes. There's no way to adjust that. All your position keyframes and scale keyframes have smoothing on them, where rotation is linear. And that's something that they haven't added to this version, but I know that they're looking to add the adjustment for that in future versions. Now if I wanted to move this keyframe and say, well, I don't really want it here, I can just click and drag it anywhere I want, and now that keyframe's in a different location. So now it's more like a loop here. So that's the basics for creating keyframes. Now if I want to add a keyframe just in the timeline, like I want one in the middle here, I can control click on the Mac or right click on the PC and just go add keyframe. Now it's added a keyframe in that position that I can then move my object somewhere else or do something to that object to add a keyframe there. And you can delete them by doing the same thing by holding your mouse over it and right clicking on the PC or control clicking on the Mac and going to delete keyframe. Now at every keyframe, it's recording for everything for this object. There are no individual keyframes for the different axes, for rotation, scaling, morphing. All that is recorded in one keyframe. They are not split up. So if you are doing things like rotating objects, it's going to, like if you're going to rotate and position your object, it's going to record all of the state of the object at that particular keyframe. So if I were to come to this frame here and do a rotation to my object and add a keyframe, now what it's done is it's recorded not only the rotation, but that position and that shape of the object, and everything about that object that can be keyframed has been recorded at that particular point. So now if I were to move this and say, well, I really want it rotated over here, well, the problem is that the actual position for that object has been changed and keyframed there at the same time. So if you're doing, say, something like, for example, a looping spinning globe, but you also want it to move, you'll want to have parent objects to move your object, and I will talk about that a little bit later. But whenever you're animating an object, it records everything for that object. So keep in mind as you're animating that if you start doing multiple things to your object, like rotations and position and scale and morphs and all that, it records all of it for the frames that you add keyframes. Now it's the same with lights and cameras as with objects as far as creating keyframes. As you notice here, the camera and the light in the scene have keyframes as well. So if I were to have my timeline set to a position where there wasn't a keyframe for the camera, and then I go to move my camera, now it's going to ask me as well, it's going to say that there's no keyframe for it, do you want to add a keyframe? And so I'm going to go ahead and add a keyframe. Now if I rotate my camera here, now you can see the animation happening for my camera. Now when it creates a keyframe, keep in mind that keyframes are direct line of sight. As far as, like, when it makes an in-between, it's going to, the in-betweens to interpolate for the movement, it's going to go the quickest route possible. So if I undo this and then create my keyframe again for my camera and then rotate completely in the opposite direction, now you'll notice that the camera is going in a straight line. It's not doing that nice rotation. So what I'm going to have to do is actually make multiple keyframes to get that to have a nice arc, because you may think that it's going to remember the rotation, but because the camera is just being repositioned using the orbit tool, it's just saying, oh, it's now at this location, so make a straight line path to go there. So what you'll want to do in that case would be to maybe make 3 different positions to get the arc. So now if I come in here and do this again, now it should give me more of a rotation. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're animating objects that and cameras and lights, is that it will go direct line to the position or rotation even. So if you want, also another thing to keep in mind too is that when rotating objects, let me just delete some keyframes here on this object, start with it fresh. Okay, so now if I were to rotate this object here and add a keyframe, actually I'll go ahead and add a keyframe for that object, and now I rotate this, and let's go ahead and do it numerically so you can see this a little better. If I change the rotation on the Y, so to spin it like a globe, so to speak, if I were to change this to 360 and hit OK, and now move my, you'll notice that it's not changing, because according to the computer 360 is the same as 0, and the position of the object did not change according to the computer. So Amorphium looks at the distance between the rotations to create the movement. So in order for me to create a complete 360-degree rotation, I actually have to make 3 keyframes, because if I were to go from 0 to 180 and then back to 0, it's going to go rotate one direction, then that same direction to go back. It won't actually make a complete loop. So the best way to create a complete looping rotation is to create 3 keyframes. So like, for example, I'll create this keyframe and go into numeric, the property numeric. So now in order to get this rotation to work, I'm going to need to make those 3 keyframes by making the first one, 1/3 of 360, which would be 120. And let's go ahead and move this over to 1 here. And then at the next keyframe, let me go ahead and make the keyframe. And then in this particular keyframe, go back into properties and go back into properties and change this now to 240. And then because Amorphium does not recognize the difference between 360 and 0, I can just put this back to 0 again. So now I should have a nice rotation going. And that's how you'd have to create your rotations to make a completely seamless rotation, is because it's going direct line of sight again. It's saying, to go from this angle to this angle, then to this angle, this angle. If I were to say I wanted to rotate from 0 to 359 degrees, it's actually only going to rotate 1 degree in the opposite direction, as opposed to going all the way around to 359. So you actually have to create multiple keyframes to get it to follow that direction, because it's going to go the shortest rotational route to those keyframes. And now, if I wanted this to actually be rotating again on a different axis as well, I'd have to do it on those same exact keyframes again, or on, if I were to add a rotational keyframe in here, it's actually going to record all the axis rotations in the same keyframe. So keep that in mind, that everything for the object is recorded on the keyframes, and that you'd have to use parenting to get around that, which I will show later on. But that's the basics for working with keyframes on rotation and movement with your objects, cameras, and lights.